The seeds of the Civil War were really sown when the Founding Fathers framed the Constitution. You're going to have an agreement in there, the 3/5 compromise, in which, slaves were sort of sometimes people or 3/5 of a person, and a series of compromises and issues throughout the 19th century, the first half of it, is going to only make that issue more and more complex. In 1820, trying to keep parity in the Senate between slave states and free states, you're going to have a compromise where one of each state enters the Union. You're going to have a slave uprising, Nat Turner's Rebellion, which is going to foment fears in the South about more slave uprisings. You're going to have a war with Mexico, which Yankees in the North would see as a war of Southern conquest, where you have people in the South starting to frame the argument that states should be able to decide whether they are free states or slave states. That's an interesting thing throughout this time. By 1840s, you're going to have this argument of us against them. It is North against South, South against North. It's the same country, they spoke the same language, but the perception of North and South was growing to make a wider gap. By the 1850s, you're going to have the Compromise of 1850, which is eventually going to destroy the parity in the Senate, but it's also going to forgive some debts for southern states, as well as adding a fugitive slave law, which is going to force people who might even be against slavery to be complicit in it, to return slaves to their masters if they escape into non-slave holding areas. You were going to have, of course, Uncle Tom's Cabin come out, which is going to sell more than 1 million copies in the first couple of years. You are also going to have, of course, John Brown's Raid, which is just going to make these passions stronger, and these erupt into literally people bringing guns into the Senate chamber. You're going to have Kansas erupt into what is now known as Bleeding Kansas, where pro-slavery forces from Missouri come in and fight against anti-slavery forces from New England, and eventually this stuff will all erupt and come to a head in the election of 1860, when Abraham Lincoln, a Republican, a liberal Republican, who said he wasn't going to free any of the slaves or tamper with slavery where it already existed, was perceived by the South as being hostile to slavery, and that is the reason the Southern states gave as they seceded in 1860 and early to mid-1861, and the Civil War will begin at Fort Sumter in April 1861. After the firing on Fort Sumter, both sides, North and South, started to raise huge, enormous armies. The biggest armies in the world eventually will gather on this continent. You're going to have them gathering around Washington, D.C., and also in the West. The North immediately institutes a blockade of southern ports, which eventually will have a huge impact upon the South, especially given in the West a series of victories at Fort Donelson, at Shiloh, at the capture of Corinth, Mississippi, and eventually later in the war when Vicksburg falls and then Chattanooga falls. The South, especially in the West, is being shrunk, while you're going to have in the East a series of battles fought by a series of Northern commanders, generally against Confederate General Robert E. Lee, in which the troops are going back and forth from Manassas down to outside of Richmond, up toward Manassas again in Antietam, and then down in the Fredericksburg area, up to Gettysburg, and down slowly, inexorably toward Richmond. As the war wears on, the Southern territory is shrinking, the blockade is really working, and ultimately, by the end of the war, April 1865, Southern forces are compelled to surrender, namely at Appomattox and at Bennett's Place in North Carolina. And with the end of the Civil War also came the assassination of President Lincoln. Lincoln, who had emancipated the slaves as a war measure on the first day of 1863, who was so key in passing the 13th Amendment. But his assassination itself did not help relations between the North and the South. And he was just one of so many as a result of this conflict that would die. 620,000 dead as a result of this conflict. Some suggestions are that that number is way too low, actually. So it's important that we reflect back upon the Civil War, what it means to our country, and that is one of the reasons the Civil War Trust is so interested in saving so much battlefield land. 30 acres of battlefield land are lost to development every day.